Hello again, and welcome back to The City Beneath, a roguelite dungeon crawler in vanilla Minecraft. This is part 4 of the Devlog series. Today I am going over some new structures in the cavern, the layout for the cavern's route to all of the dungeon doors, and a new enemy spawning system. Follow along with me as I try to answer the question of what makes a good cavern monster different from a good dungeon monster. First, I want to take you through the route in the cavern as it stands right now. The entrance to the cavern has been covered before and it hasn't changed. There is a sword in the barrel and you fight a couple of zombies. But after you navigate through your first fight, we can now find a villager hiding in one of the walls. This villager may not ultimately end up right in this spot, but for now it works. Villager 1, as I'm calling them for the moment, is here to let the player know that other villagers can be found hiding in the cavern. If you look hard enough to find them, they will provide you with a helpful service, be that potions, weapons, or even special dungeon-based quests. The second fight has now been scripted and takes place back in a small tunnel section. This section may also be used as a teaching puzzle in the future, something to give the player a taste of puzzles yet to come in the dungeons. A few of the barrels now spawn items in them, like swords and food. This may be randomized in the future with custom loot table data, but I may save that for the dungeons themselves. I've added an offshoot here that I'm calling the healing room. Like the villager, this may not be its final location. When you walk in, you are immediately boosted back up to full health. Helpful areas like this give the player some ease of mind after running through a dungeon. Next, we trigger our third cavern fight right before the entrance to the first dungeon is opened. This terraced section over here is intended to show a kind of communal area where maybe some sort of gatherings were held before it was abandoned. The terraces also conceal the first dungeon door underneath. Since the first dungeon will be a wooded theme, having the area covered in wooden materials starts the theming before you enter the door. The number of enemies you have slayed so far is just enough to raise your advancement to level 1 and open this door. The dungeon doors after this will be based on advancement as well as whether you've defeated the previous dungeon or not. I felt this end of the cavern was missing something that made the area look lived in and used. I've had an image of a crane in my head since I started the map and I felt this was a perfect place to add it. Next, we could make our way up to the second dungeon right after the first, or we could pass by it and explore the cavern a little more. These stone stairs are candlelit and lead nowhere but the second dungeon. The second dungeon will have a sort of caving theme, so having the stone leading you to the door felt appropriate. Nearby the steps, we can enter the mines. Keeping with the caving theme of the second dungeon nearby, I'm hoping I can come up with a puzzle of some sort to give the player a great permanent reward. All of this takes place underneath of the crumbling scaffolded buildings above. This section of buildings feels a bit chaotic to me, and that's mostly on purpose. I wanted this section to feel like it's falling apart. You'll find a broken railing, broken beams, and half of a room hanging precariously above. With a bit more detail work, I hope to really sell the feeling of deterioration all around you. One of the rooms even has a barrel that seems inaccessible unless you can find a clever way to get up there. Further along this route, you'll find some stairs leading up to the crumbling buildings, as well as to a couple of structures that I'm calling cliff dwellings. The intention with the cliff dwellings is to make these structures feel even older than the other wooden scaffolded buildings around the cavern. I love the way these feel like they are just carved right back into the walls of the cavern. To continue the progression of the cavern, you must cross the river, and the only way to do that here is to jump across it. With the water being instant death, this is pretty high risk. Navigate under a building and across this bridge, and you'll then be able to enter the third dungeon. I'm pretty set on the third dungeon's theme being water-based to some extent, but I haven't gotten further than that in the plan yet. The exit of the third dungeon will be back over on the other side near this yet undecided building. This final building is still trying to figure out what it wants to be when it grows up. I know the player will encounter it after the third dungeon along the path to the fourth, but I have no real use for it at the moment. However, I've found multiple times so far that as I'm building, I look for places to put something I have an idea for, and a nice empty building sure comes in handy in those instances. But after that, there's only one more place to go. Up the wooden stairs and through a small, winding cave brings you finally to the entrance of the fourth dungeon. The area up here isn't fully built out yet, and won't be until we've moved forward a little more with the dungeons themselves. I'm thinking either a villager or another puzzle will fit in perfectly up here. The lighting of the cavern is mostly finished, and any changes will be detail dependent. I'm slowly refining the placement of the candles to reinforce calm or stress throughout the build. For instance, early sections like the first couple of fights in the cavern and the villagers you meet will all be well lit. But the area where you hop across the toxic water and navigate the lower level of the cavern is quite dark. Now, let's take a look at our small dialogue system for the villager we have set up. The dialogue stab is triggered by a skulk sensor aimed straight up under where the player will stand when they enter the room. When triggered, a pulse extender is activated and a sticky piston holding wool covers the top of the skulk sensor so that nothing can trigger it again until the pulse dies out. This system prevents the dialogue getting triggered over and over without any scoreboard timer shenanigans. Finally, I want to talk about some of the mechanical tweaks to spawning enemies I've made. I've been thinking about what I want the cavern to be in relation to the actual dungeons. I have decided that part of the purpose of a hub location like this is to give the player a sense of familiarity and eventually safety. I want the player to feel like they have conquered something and made change over time. The dungeons will always reset and always be dangerous. That is the purpose they hold. But I don't think the cavern has to be the same way. It will be dangerous at first, but over time I want it to feel like a refuge. So in order to do this, I have set up a tiered enemy spawning system in the cavern. It's best explained like this. We have fights A, B, and C. Each fight has information about it being tracked, like whether the enemies have spawned in, and whether that fight has been defeated or not. When the player first starts the map, Fight A will trigger. If they die during Fight A and respawn, then Fight A will trigger again. If they get through Fight A and trigger Fight B, then Fight A will be deemed conquered and never trigger again. This way, the player can slowly make their rounds and conquer the cavern in a way that they really can't in the dungeons. So far, while I've been working out the spawning system in the cavern, I've had mob drops turned off. But when I started to work on how spawning would function in a dungeon, I realized I want mobs to start dropping items on death. For the life of me, I could not think of a way to get the same mob to drop different items depending on the area they were in. I went down a route where I tried to spawn in items when specifically named entities died. And this worked for a bit until I reset the game and a ton of items spawned because all of the zombies died. Free loot, but pretty game breaking. Eventually, I remembered loot tables. Loot tables are used for many different things in Minecraft, like dungeon chests, fishing treasure, and of course, mob drops. This was my first time working with loot tables, but after a bit of a learning curve, I worked out the ability to summon enemies with specific death loot tables. Death loot tables are exactly what they sound like. They are the items that have a chance to drop when a mob dies. And because they are loot tables, you can tie all sorts of conditions based on the player and the environment, the type and probability of the drops. I have a pretty basic loot table setup for the cavern enemies, but I'm sure I will be playing around with loot tables a lot more as the map progresses. As I was working on the spawning system, I wanted to add a test boss to the first dungeon. This would be an enemy that spawned every time the player got close and dropped a specific item that no other enemy would drop. This was able to be added with the same loot table system as the other enemies. In the summon command, I specified the Dungeon 1 boss loot table, and voila, boss fight. I also managed to give this boss some extra health and a boss bar. That covers all the recent updates to The City Beneath. Thank you for taking the time to have a look at the changes with me. I'm very excited for the next stage of this map's development, as I will be starting on the first dungeon. If you like Minecraft map building, or devlog content in general, subscribe to follow along and catch the next part in the series. Until then, so long.